Hello friends, this is Growl. It's time to address one of the most common questions I get as a healer and content creator for WoW. You're getting into the game fresh, or maybe you play another role and you want to try healing, but healing is stressful though, and you don't want to invoke the wrath of the random neckbeards in your dungeon groups. You mostly want things to go smoothly even if you don't know what the heck you're doing. What is the best healer for beginners to have success with? In this video, I'm going to rank each healer from, in only my personal opinion, what is the worst to best healer for a beginner to start off with. A video like this needs a disclaimer. Most importantly, if you're a beginner, you're gonna suck. The only way you're gonna get better is to play a lot. And the only way you're gonna play a lot is if you like your class and you're having fun. Pick something that resonates with you first, because you aren't gonna be a beginner forever and you don't wanna set yourself up for failure down the line. Fun is the most important thing after all. I mean, we are playing a game, even though World of Warcraft might seem like a job at times. Secondly, you might not like healing. The second factor that I would use to pick a class is pick something that has other specs you might enjoy if healing isn't for you. If you're mainly a tank player, making a Druid or a Paladin or a Monk because they have a tank spec makes much more sense if you don't enjoy healing, because then you can still use that character to tank. Likewise, if you enjoy ranged DPS, you don't want to get stuck making a Monk or a Paladin and then having a dead character. As a healer main myself, I've made alts for different roles to play ranged DPS and tank, but ultimately they always turn into healers except for the characters that can't, and those end up rotting. Well, except for my mage. I love my mage. Lastly, not everyone finds the same things difficult. For some, having to DPS while healing can seem like an absolute death sentence and a turnoff, but for others this is natural and preferred. Some people might find casting easy, but others don't like being glued to the floor. I'm going to try and break down exactly what I think makes each healer easy or hard. Factors include things like how many keybinds do they have, how proactive do you be, how complex the rotation is, what sorts of drawbacks does that healer gimmick have, and most importantly, is the healer strong right now, although that does change. I know some people don't like to hear it, but strength can play a big part into how easy a healer is to pick up. If you fit into teams well and your heals are big, it's going to be a lot easier for you than if you're playing an unpopular spec, regardless of how simple or complex the rotation is. Keep in mind, this does change from patch to patch. The following is just my opinion looking at the beta right now going into the War Within. So number one, the absolute worst healer to play as a beginner is Discipline Priest. Right now, Discipline Priest is just not really a straightforward healer that also has many pitfalls. So in order to heal, you need to use certain spells that apply a buff called Atonement to your party. Then whenever you deal damage, your allies with Atonement are healed for a percentage of the damage dealt. This means you need to be proactive, maintaining those atonements on the right targets, and choosing which damage abilities that you're using at the right time. The damage rotation isn't super complex, but it can be really tough for new players. Not only are you juggling your casting on your friends and your foes, but you also need to have an understanding of what damage is about to come up. Disc Priest especially struggles with pushing the health bars back up from unexpected damage. Your main cooldowns are going to involve powerful shields and barriers that reduce the incoming damage. But these things are useless if your party already took it and then you're like, oh no, what do I do? And they're rotting out. Another major drawback is the lack of mobility in defensives. Priest is noticeably lacking on very good defensive abilities and also wears cloth armor, so you're gonna get hit real hard by certain abilities. Look, I'm not saying that Disc Priest can't be a good healer, it's just that if you're a new player, you're definitely really up for the challenge, or I would avoid Disc Priest. Second on my list is Preservation Evoker. Although DPS isn't required like this priest is, this spec does have its own handful of challenges. Preservation is the most positioning and range dependent hero. Its gimmick is that its abilities only have 30 yards compared to other healers, which are all 40 yards or more. On top of that, many of the big healing spells, such as Dream Breath, require your team to be bunched together or at least somewhat close, which can be a nightmare in beginner groups full of people that don't know the mechanics of the dungeon or just don't know how your healer works. Evoker's single target healing, if someone's taking a lot of damage, is probably like the weakest among most of the healers. It also relies on a mix of like well-timed abilities, stuff that negates the damage, and sort of like combo spells such as Echo or Verdant Embrace. Sequencing of your abilities is really big as Evoker. Your main spender for your essences is Echo, an ability that puts a buff on an ally that replicates your next healing spell. This means that if you're not pre-placing your echoes on the right targets and using the right spells, you are wasting quite a bit of value. Some of your spells with Evoker also have some forced movement involved. Burden Embrace, like I mentioned, is a decent single target heal, but it dashes you to the target that you use, potentially putting you in danger. Rescue is another ability that shields yourself and a nearby ally, but it causes you to grab them and relocates to wherever you decide. Although Evoker's heal buttons are mainly just like push it and the health bar goes up, it can still lend itself to being a pretty proactive healer, needing those echoes set up beforehand. You may want to have hots applied, and you may also even want to pre-cast your big empowered spells, as that can play a big part in staying alive. Again, I hate being negative about classes because Evoker can be really fun to play. It's super rewarding when things go right, and I played it a decent amount in the first season of Dragonflight when it came out. I just don't think in its current state I would really recommend it for someone who is just starting off healing, unless you think you can juggle the sequencing and the positioning well while still keeping everyone alive. Third on the list of hardest to easiest healers to pick up, I have Resto Druid. Resto Druid is a shape-shifting healer that relies on mostly heal over time effects to keep the party alive. Resto Druid's mastery increases your healing for each heal over time effect on the person you're healing, making stacking multiple of those hots across your party essential for surviving really heavy burst damage. This makes Resto Druid like the definition of proactive healer. Without having a strong grasp of the damage patterns, it can be really tough to keep people topped. That being said, Druid does have some upfront healing options. It's not entirely heal over time, so you're not entirely just left to die if you don't know what's going on. And generally speaking, in lower level dungeons, the damage isn't so crazy that you need to, have everything up. Usually you won't get punished unless you're totally asleep at the wheel. You can also select some talents and builds that give you a little bit more like initial punch on your spells. One nice thing about Druid healing is that you don't really rely on major cooldowns. You don't need to know when to use certain major abilities. Most of your dungeon healing is just done with your basic healing. Once you get an idea of like how the encounter works, what the boss does, you sort of just do the routine and keep going. In raids, however, Druid is actually very cooldown reliant. I would say it's very difficult in raid. You have short burst windows where your raid takes a lot of damage, and then you need to have all your hots up for that window. In both raid and M+, though, a nice thing about Druid is that it's flexible in moving around. A lot of its casts are instant and ranged, so you can move freely everywhere without having to worry about swirlies or frontals. Another drawback of Druid is the large amount of keybinds. Druid has the most amount of potential keybinds of any healer or any class, because the additional requirement of shape-shifting to change forms, and just in general having a large utility kit. Most of your healing will be just in normal caster form, so don't let this scare you. If you like the shape-shifting aesthetic, if you think that's cool, it's not like totally the end of the world. It's just something that you have to consider. Another nice thing about Druid is that it fits in well with a lot of team compositions. So you have a group buff, Mark of the Wild, that's among one of the strongest group buffs that any healer can bring. You also have a stealth to help you sneak back to groups, as well as a battle res when people fall, so you can res them in combat. Very handy in 5-man dungeons. I don't think Druid is like an incredibly difficult healer. I just sort of think it's kind of middle of the road-ish, but I would warn you about the drawbacks so that you know what you're getting into before you decide to learn Druid. In one short jump up, in sort of the middle ground, and almost being the polar opposite of Druid, is Paladin. Paladin is a melee-based healer with almost entirely instant cast abilities. Your healing rotation, though, is actually quite complex. You have Holy Shock, which is a mana-efficient heal with a cooldown. You're basically casting it whenever it's up. And then in between Holy Shocks, you're generating and then spending Holy Power, which is a separate resource that's not mana. It's quite simple. You just basically press buttons that give it to you and then you spend it. Holy Paladin doesn't really have a spammable heal like the other healers do. It relies on constantly building up your Holy Power and then spending it. You do have hard cast heals. They're just much weaker than the other healers and only really used for emergencies. Holy Paladin has two major setbacks, I would say, that make it complex. First off, it is melee. You're required to be in melee to be hitting Crusader Strike, which is your main holy power generator. As a healer, things in melee can get quite chaotic when you tend to have your eyes glued on the party frames, especially with so much utility and single target healing that Paladin has. So even with plate armor and a shield, you can often feel like you're like dying a lot or standing in swirlies or frontals. Secondly, Paladin is very cooldown reliant. So unlike Druid, Paladin has some of the strongest healing cooldowns and situational utility in the game, but you need to know how and when to use it. You know, you'll have abilities that immune movement impairing effects, immune to physical damage reduction, and knowing what types of things are happening to you knows that, okay, you need to use the certain blessings. Just trying to like brute force, just spam all your heals and encounters won't really work once you start getting into some of the harder fights. Although Paladin healing is like completely upfront and straightforward, it does require some planning. You're spacing out those cooldowns and knowing what to use at the right times. That being said, Paladin's still a great addition to dungeon groups. Its upfront healing is super good. Once you get the rotation down, it can kind of feel like you're playing whack-a-mole, which bam, you get a heal, you get a heal. And Paladin also has a bubble. You have Divine Shield, which gives you a flat immunity every 3.5 minutes. No other healer has an immunity. I mean, this can be a game changer if you're getting overwhelmed or if things are in danger. You just bam, bubble, and then you're immune and you can just focus on keeping your team alive. I haven't talked a whole lot about strength of the healers in this video, but right now I would say out of everything I've talked so far, Paladin is the strongest. Healing wise, it's putting up really good numbers for both healing and damage on the beta right now. So I do think we're going to see a decent number of Paladins during season 1 of the War Within. For the third best healer for beginners on this list, I have Mistweaver Monk. Monk is similar to Paladin in that it has a lot of instant casts and also is a melee healer. The main difference is that its healing is mostly smart healing and comes entirely from dealing damage. So you have a buff called Ancient Teachings, and whenever you deal damage, it converts it to healing on your party. So you're basically just maintaining that buff and then beating up the mobs, and then the healing disperses throughout your party. Most of the time, you're not even really worried about specific party members, just sort of doing the smart healing. You can focus a lot more of your time and energy on staying alive in melee and doing your DPS. Mistweaver is much less cooldown reliant than Paladin as well. Many of its cooldowns are simply reactive, like you press a button and then bam, everyone in your party gets healed, versus the Paladins that are much more situational. You basically just pair your DPS like healing, fist weaving playstyle, doing your rotation, beating up the mobs. Then as you start to fall behind, bam, you press a cooldown, go back to fist weaving, and that's sort of rinse repeat. Pretty simple. I mean, you can repeat it in most encounters. You do have the ability to hard cast. Again, it's sort of like Paladin. It's not really recommended. For Mistweaver, it's a little bit stronger, but it can drain your mana very, very quickly. Mistweaver has a lot of situational utility that you need to have a good understanding of that's not quite as strong and as reliable as Paladin stuff. Like, for example, Ring of Peace, it creates a ring on the ground that pushes mobs away from it in all directions when you use. This can be a really good zoning tool, but also you can just troll your team by pushing a mob behind your tank or just spreading mobs out in different directions if you're used poorly. Mistweaver's group buff also gives increased physical damage, which is okay in some comms, but is less useful in general. Most dungeon groups have at least 1 or 2 casters. Overall, its healing is solid. It tends to not always quite fit in as well as Paladin, but personally, I think as a beginner, you'll probably have an easier time as Mistweaver over Paladin and Pugs, but Paladin is preferred in the higher level groups. The second best healer for beginners in the War Within, in my opinion, is Holy Priest. Every healer so far has some sort of gimmick to it. There's this melee and this is heal over time and atonements and range. Holy Priest gimmick is literally just exactly what you picture as a healer from an RPG. Its main spell is literally called Heal. Your rotation involves just casting single target heals, big ones, small ones, mana efficient, instant casts. It's entirely a reactive playstyle with very little preparing for upcoming damage. You're playing the red bar game. See the bar go down, press heal, bar go up. On top of this, Holy Priest generally isn't really cooldown reliant. Your basic rotation of healing is enough to keep your party alive most of the time. This might sound like the easiest, most straightforward healer ever. How is this only number 2? But there is some drawbacks that Priest has. First is that Holy does struggle a little bit with AoE healing or just party healing. Burst damage on everybody for newer players can be a bit overwhelming, and knowing when to remain calm and like heal the right people can be tough at times. As I mentioned with Disc Priest as well, Holy Priest has low movement options and is pretty squishy with cloth armor. Holy does have the added benefit of Spirit of Redemption. When you die, you stay alive as a ghost that you can heal your teammates for a short time so that you're not totally griefing everybody when you walk into something bad. Another concern with Holy Priest is that it does have quite a few spell combos that you have to worry about. Using certain heals buffs other heals. Use your basic heals to reduce the cooldown of your more powerful heals. You can kind of just sort of play whack-a-mole with your abilities, but what I'm saying is, although it's simple, there is actually quite a bit of depth if you're trying to get the maximum output, which honestly isn't even really a bad thing. Now for the number 1 healer for beginners in the War Within is Resto Shaman. Restoration Shaman right now overall is just such a fun and powerful healer. Similar to Holy Priest, your rotation is very straightforward. You have mana efficient heals, mana spenders, big AoE heals, and the major difference is that your AoE heals are actually really big and potent. You have Chain Heal and Healing Rain alongside really powerful talents, can actually push the health bars of your party up in a pinch. Shaman's 3 major cooldowns also received new improved talents this expansion, giving you even more AoE healing power. Shaman also has a bit more flexibility because spells increase the max HP of the party, and also your Earth Shields reduce the incoming damage on yourself and the tank. This ends up smoothing the damage that your party takes and gives you a little bit more time to react. The biggest major drawback from newer players is Shaman's absolutely massive toolkit of optional utility spells. The Shaman talent tree has like 20 different nodes of things that you can possibly take that might help in random situations. These abilities are like very different. It's not just, oh, you take X or Y. They're not binary choices. You end up needing a lot of different keybinds and space on your screen to track stuff. On top of that, your utility has a lot more interaction with the mobs compared to Priest. You have a direct interrupt that Priest doesn't have. You also just have more disruption with AoE stops and knockups, which is great when you get good at using it, but it can be a bit overwhelming for newer players when you're just trying to get a handle on healing and people might be expecting you to use those things. Overall though, besides for the just higher keybinds and more utility, I think Shaman personally checks all the boxes for what I would make as a good healer to start off in the War Within. So that wraps up my list, from worst to best healers for beginners starting off in the expansion. I assume there's going to be a lot of newer healers in this video, so if you guys have advice for starting off, important things that you think I missed, definitely leave them down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and happy keying, friends.